let's take a look at the meeting house.
Okay, let's take a look at it.
And you are the chairman of the Pembroke Friends Meeting House Trustee Committee?
The trustees, that's correct. That's an arm of the Pembroke Historical Society. I'm also the chairman of the Pembroke Historical Commission.
Very nice.
This building, as you can see from the small sign in the front, was built in 1706. Over the years, there was a lot of, not necessarily controversy, but question as to the origin of this building. That mystery was solved about 25 years ago. We do know one thing, that this building was built here on this spot in 1706 by Robert Barker, a Pembroke Quaker. Would you like to go in?
Oh, I'd love to go in. Thank you.
Okay, come on in. We are entering the men's side. As you can see, there are two doors here on the little porch. The women had their own entrance, and the gentlemen had their own entrance. And we're going to break with tradition, and we're going in the men's entrance. As you come in the door, you'll see these very steep set of stairs which lead to the gallery above. Okay, and we're entering the main portion of the meeting house. As you can see, it's a two-story structure. It is divided by this set of panels which go up and down, so that the ladies who sit on the west side of the meeting house can conduct their business, and the gentlemen on the east side of the meeting house can conduct their business. Now, the meeting house didn't look like this when it was originally built. When it was originally built, there was no front porch. It did not have a gable roof, it had a hip roof. And the stairwell leading to the galleries, which you can see up above us here, was in the southeast corner of the building. During our research and restoration in 1987, we uncovered a lot of architectural markers or indicators which tell us what happened, and because we found the old Quaker records, we now know when it happened. I always found it interesting that the men got the nice big fireplace and the ladies got a little wood stove, but you know. This wood stove was, I believe, purchased by the Quakers in 1811, if my memory serves me correct, and it was used continuously. In 1987, of course, the stove was still here and it was in some disrepair, and a Quaker from Marshfield by the name of George Greenemeyer, who's also a professor of art at Massachusetts College of Art and a well-known sculptor in metal, stopped by, saw what we were doing, saw the situation with the stove, and offered to repair it and to actually fabricate a couple of missing parts, which he did. So for all intent and purposes, it could be a working wood stove, but of course, for fire safety hazards, it could never be used in this building. If you look here up in the wall, in the panel, you'll see a little opening, a piece of stone with a hole in it. That was where the pipe from the wood stove on the ladies' side came up. It was suspended on some hangers, came across, and it went right into the wall here above the fireplace. So it was vented out through the main chimney. But of course, and we do have some old photographs showing the pipe still there, but of course it's been gone for many, many years. Seated now, as you can tell from the angle, we are slightly above the main floor of the meeting house. There is a two-tier riser at this end. We're seated on the north wall of the meeting house. This is where the elders of the congregation would have sat. The Quakers did not have a hierarchy in the sense that most churches have. There were no ministers, there were no priests, there were no preachers, deacons, or anything of that nature. The Quakers believed that each person was their own intermediary with God. However, because any organization has to have some structure, they did have elders. And the elders, I'm sure, oversaw things like making decisions about what to do about the building, and you know, if they had to do a repair, how they were going to fund that repair, and so forth and so on. But they would come in here, the members of the congregation, and they would sit quietly until someone of them felt the Spirit move them to speak. And at that time, they were free to get up and say what was on their mind. And or they could sit in silent solitude with their thoughts and their relationship with their God. This was called the inner light. Historically, you read about the Quakers, they talk about the inner light, and that is the basis of their spirituality. Eventually, the men and women had their own area where they conducted their services and conducted business for the meeting. Typically, when they met together, men and women together, but they each had their own specific areas for which they were responsible. So they were able to separate it. And these panels on this interior wall, which go up and down like a window panel, that was not added until 1833, over 100 years after the original building was built. And as I said in my earlier comments, this building went through a substantial change in 1833, and that's when these panels were added. Interestingly enough, there was if you'd like to come down this way, and maybe when you go outside, I can give you an added picture of what I'm going to describe. There is sufficient evidence regarding where the women sat originally. There was a small building attached to this building, and it was one level, and it went over to the east, and that was removed and taken away, and it was sold to a family by the name of Collimore. We believe that that building is the little antique on the corner of Scousett Street and Brick Hill Lane. So when you go outside the building, you will see that on the back side of this fireplace here, there's a little bump out in the wall, and it's very curious when you see it for the first time. Why would they build it like that? Well, when we took the shingles off the outer wall and did some research to what was underneath, we could see that there was clearly marks from an interior lath wall, which clearly indicated that there was a wall going the other way. And it makes sense, because in the old Quaker records, they used to close off the gallery. And if you look up here, you can see a board that runs along. They used to put boards across from side to side during the winter to keep it warm, because everybody knows heat rises. This is a big open building, and it must have been very hard to keep it warm. So they put planks over it to keep them warm. When they took away the little meeting house where the women met, brought them inside, put them on this side, they added the wood stove, and I guess apparently that helped address the heating problem. There's something I'd like to show you, which I've always been in love with. When we restored this building in 1987, we found some things we just could not bring ourselves to cover up with fresh paint. Now it's been 25 years, so the paint might not look quite as fresh as it was in 1987. But this little picture here, you really have to come around and zero in on it. This little picture here was, well, we can only surmise that it was some child who was probably bored, as kids do when they're in church, and decided to do a little artwork on the back of the bench. And it says 1690, and then it says, going to Quaker Meeting House. And then it has, I believe the date there is like 1840. whenever the little kid did it, oh, excuse me, it says 1890, right there, not 1690. So some small child was bored and did a little artwork. There's another evidence of it right over here. It looks like this little picture over here. It appears to be an effort to draw a horse or a mule, which of course pulled the wagon to Quaker Meeting House. So we made sure that we didn't paint over it, and we think that's kind of cool. Would you like to go upstairs? Okay. We go out back towards the front here. There's a very narrow staircase which leads up to the second floor. And as you can see, they're so steep, I do not want to be in front of you. Now, here you'll find us on the second floor of the meeting house. This part of the meeting house is essentially original to the early construction. If you look at the width of these floorboards, gives you some idea. You can see the width of the original boards, and you can see, you know, these mortises in the floor from where the original framework of the original staircase was. And if Laura would just step aside for a moment there, you can see in this corner of the building where the original staircase came out. Now, the Quakers were very thrifty and economical people, like most people were in those days. And when they built the little addition on the front of the building, the entryway with the two doors, the framework that was used for the original staircase, which was chamfered, and chamfering is this kind of work, where they do decorative edging. You can see it down here. This is, we found that the floorboards for the porch were pieces of the original framework, because we found the chamfered lumber that created the framework from this. And at the time we restored it, there was a question as to whether we would remove some of them and store them, and it was decided that we know where they are, they're safe, and we're just better off leaving them where they are. This door I always find fascinating. It is latched. This is what we're fairly confident was the original outside door, and if you look at it closely, you can see the hand-cut wooden nail heads. It's extremely weathered and pitted and rough. One of the things, now we do have the latch. It was removed for safekeeping during part of work that was done here a while ago. But we do know where it is, and that is going to be restored. This door, we believe, was the original front door, which actually was on the west wall of the building downstairs. We can go back and look at that a little bit. We believe they trimmed it down a bit and then brought it upstairs, reinforced it, and used it as one of the doors here. Now if you come through here, this is the ladies' side, you see a similar piece of door there. Again, this is we believe to be part of the original structure, square, hand-cut nails, the original latch on the door. It's pretty impressive to see first period architectural features still in existence in this day and age, especially in a wooden building. They tend to suffer the damages of time, weather, insects, and so forth. We assume it's for overflow, maybe for kids, maybe some of the Quakers, believe it or not, were slave owners. The slaves would have sat up here, maybe household help who attended the meetings with their employers. But certainly it was, it was less than probably comfortable to sit in. Reminds me of the old Gillette Stadium. This is a nice view looking down the interior. You can see again, you can see the risers that lead to the seating for the elders, the stove. You can clearly tell looking down that we had to replace the floor on the interior. These boards are new to 1987. But that is certainly appropriate. The condition of the existing floorboards, which had been turned at least once, which again was another common practice in those days, as the tops of the floorboards got worn, they'd take the floor up and flip them over and use them again. But they were very, very dry, very brittle, and there was a lot of insect damage to some of them, so we had to replace them. There was no choice. These benches, interestingly enough, that you're looking down on, these date only from 1853, the point of the last restoration of the building. The original benches probably looked similar to the ones up here and probably just as uncomfortable. But these we know date to 1853. Either 1833 or 53, but we believe it's 1853.
Are these windows original?
Well, actually, these windows up here are not the original building, the original windows in the building. And it's interesting, if you come over, I'll give you a little pointer. You can see that the original windows were much smaller because this board actually is extended across here and went in here and continued here. When they put the windows in, and for some reason they were very good craftsmen, but this was pretty sloppy work. They just cut the board out, moved it down here as a base for this larger window that was put in 1853. There is one older window left in the front porch. I believe I can date that to 1833. The panes of glass are much smaller, but if you look closely at this, you can see the rippling. You can tell that it's very old glass because it's rippled. You can actually feel it when you touch it. The glass was blown by hand, and the air bubbles in it. A few years ago, we had these windows restored. You can see they're in wonderful condition. The weights move. You can tell, you see we have this high-tech window opening here, and we had new storm windows made and put on to protect them from the weather, because even 1853, that makes these windows 160 years old, so they're pretty old. So, there are so many other things to see about this building. Careful going down. We're in the second floor level of the little entry porch. As you can see, the very steep set of stairs. But the window that you're seeing now with the big fat hornet in it is one of the older windows. It's 9/9, as opposed to these, which are 6/6. And these were probably, this window was put in when they created the partition in 1833. As a correction, these windows are 12/12 as opposed to 6/6. The overall dimension of the window is also smaller than the windows that now exist in the rest of the building. anything of interest on the inside that I think folks would find interesting. This was kind of a surprise to us. Back in 1987, when we did the major restoration, we had removed all the floors right down to the original stone piers, and those all had to be replaced. So it exposed the sills that the building sits on, and it exposed what was clearly the framework of a door. Now, if I could just walk over there, I don't want to get tangled here. There was the framework of a standard sized door here, and you could see it there. There was a splice in the sill, and a new piece had been cut and put into it. And it was surmised, which I think is reasonably accurate, that when they decided to close this door off and add the doors to the front, that they should replace the damage in the sill of the original building. This sill actually is a 1706 sill, and the reason we know that is it's chamfered just like the other large beams in the building. Anyways, they put this spliced piece of sill in, covered it over, plastered it, and that door went away. But what we found interesting, in the middle of the wooden splice, which dates to 1833, was a symbol of a swastika. So that initially was a little interesting, because that symbol is actually an ancient Christian symbol. It was also a symbol used by the Indians, curiously enough. So it was carved into the wood, literally 80 years before the rise of the Nazi movement, so we know it had nothing to do with a political statement by an early Quaker. But it is there. We have photographs of it before we covered it all up and fixed it. But this is the wall where the original door was, before the partitions existed, when the early stairwell that went to the second floor was in the corner. So, but it's all there for future preservationists to find and discover the next time they restore this building. And hopefully by that time someone else will do it. Okay, so you've had a visit. Do you have any questions about this building? No questions. Okay. So, okay, we're outside. We're on the east-facing wall of the meeting house. You can notice over here this bump out that I was talking about earlier. Behind this is behind what is the fireplace, the brick fireplace. So this was one of the first indicators that there was a building going this way. This charming little building over here is what is known as the privy, because even the Quakers, who had to ride off long distances, had to take care of their business. It's a 4-holer. If you just poke your camera in there, I'd stay on this end. So you can see that's typical, and there's 4 of them, and there was no partitions between them, which meant there was no privacy.
So it wasn't a very private privy.
It was not a private privy. These slabs here, we took down an immense tree a couple of years ago, which was obviously been here many, many years. We took some ring slices. One of these days we're going to sit down and count the rings and see how old it was. Unfortunately, the tree died. The tree died suddenly. In the course of 1 year, it went from being what appeared to be a perfectly healthy tree to being completely dead. Too bad. All right, so much for the privy. Okay, now we are coming to the back portion of the meeting house, where graveyard. Now understand that these are probably not all the graves that are here, but we know there were more buried here. We think we've lost some of the stones over the years. How or why, I don't know. But this is what remains. And if you see over there towards that part of the graveyard, you can see the stump of the tree that was taken down a couple of years ago. So it truly did provide shade for the resting place of many of these Quakers. Now the Quakers were not prone to ornamentation. They were very simple people. They did not adhere to the practice of calling the months of the year January, February, March. It was first month, second month, third month, and so forth. So on the older stones, you will not see traditional dates. You may just see initials. We do have the records of the Quakers, so we know who died. I've had a recent discussion with Mason Cook, who is also a trustee of the Meeting House. His ancestors were Quakers. Here's a good example of what I was just talking about. Ruth Ann Shepherd, 5th month, 31st day, 1896. She was 86 years and 9 months, 10 days. So that's a fairly recent stone, because in 1896 this meeting house was no longer being used. Nathan Shepherd, first month, it's hard to see, excuse me, 27th day, 1885.
There's his son.
And there's Nathan Jr. And he was buried here in 1912. So while the meeting house was no longer being used, the area Quakers were still burying their family members here. Here's a fairly recent burial in terms of the age of the meeting house. George Byram Shepherd, 1841-1936. Here's C.F.C. Shepherd, 1851-1924. Shepherds were Quakers. The Wests were Quakers. Many of the Barkers were Quakers. As a matter of fact, many of the movers and shakers of Pembroke were Quakers. Many of the important people in town were Quakers. Unlike in the early days of the Quakers, where they were shunned and they were often tortured and they were driven out of Massachusetts, they found a haven here in Pembroke. So this meeting house continued to be used until 1874, when the meeting was formally dissolved, and the Quakers who attended here, because they were so few at the time, became part of the Sandwich meeting. That's Sandwich, Massachusetts, and there's still a Quaker Meeting House. I don't know if the meeting house is still there, but there is a Quaker Meeting House Road. You go down the Cape, you see the sign. There was a meeting house there. In the 1920s, this building was turned over to an organization called the Friends of the Quaker Meeting House, and they took care of it as best they could for about 50 years, and then in 1972, I believe, it was deeded over to the Pembroke Historical Society. It is also vested in the town of Pembroke. some other interesting things about the Quakers that I discovered while researching this building and these people. We found the original records of this meeting down in the Rhode Island Historical Society archives at Brown University in Rhode Island. And 25 years ago, a good friend of mine, Bob O'Hara, and I took a road trip down there, and there was a single roll of microfilm that had been compiled or created in 1950 by the Mormons. Now, the Mormons, as most people understand and know, are great genealogists, and they have one of the world's, or probably the world's, most comprehensive archives on genealogy. And they go all over the country every so many years, copying, photographing, microfilming the records of births, deaths, marriages of people in every city and town and hamlet in the country. Well, they did that here, and there was a book, and it was the original record of these Quakers who discontinued the meeting in 1874. Nobody ever knew that book existed, didn't know where it was, never saw a reference to it until Bob and I were doing some research down at the Historical Society building here in town, and there was a very thin folder of information regarding the Friends Meeting House, and in it there was a letter dated 1929 to Horace T. Fogg, who was the then president of the Rockland Trust Company, and he along with two other businessmen were doing some remedial repair and restoration on this building that year. The letter alluded to records of Pembroke Quakers in Rhode Island. Wow, how do you find that out? Well, there was no internet in 1987, so I got on the phone and I called the Society of Friends in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, and asked them where would records regarding this meeting house be located. And they didn't have them there. They said I could check with the clerk of the Newport Friends Meeting House, and gave me a name and a number. I called that individual and they said, well, they didn't have records like that there, but I could check with a woman by the name of Rosalind Wiggins, who was the archivist at the Rhode Island Historical Society building. So we called her up, and she said, yes, indeed, there was one roll of microfilm. So we were very excited, and we took a road trip down there, and we discovered on that thin roll of microfilm over 1,000 pages of handwritten records of the Pembroke Quakers, dating back to the late 1600s. A friend of mine by the name of Bob O'Hara, he was the then chairman of the Pembroke Historical Commission. Bob sadly passed away about 17 years ago, but he was a very great enthusiast of history and this project here. At any rate, I read through those documents. It was not an easy task. It took me many, many months. And one of the things, what I was looking for specifically, were things related to the building itself. Who built it? You know, everybody was used to say the building was moved here from Scituate, and it was at the shipyard of Michael Wanton down in Scituate. Well, one of the things we discovered categorically and unrefutably, that it was not built there. It was not brought up the North River on the ice or on gondolas or any other method of transportation. It was built right there, right where it sits, and it was built by Robert Barker Jr., who was the father-in-law of Michael Wanton, who was the son of Edward Wanton of Scituate. So that was pretty exciting, because for over 150 years, local historians had been compounding the urban legend or the myth that the meeting house had been moved. It had not been moved. It was built here. We have copies of the original deeds, who bought it, how much it cost to build it. Those records that we found, I was able to pinpoint every single repair, change in architecture, attribute of the building, even to the point of how much it cost to the building, up until 1853. When the building, after that, 1874, the building was essentially closed. It remained closed. By the 1980s, it was clearly in danger of serious collapse. And at that time, I approached a lady by the name of Bonnie Sherman, who was a curator of the Pembroke Historical Society, and I asked her, what is the single most critical issue with the meeting house? And she said, well, clearly the sills are a problem. So the Historical Commission applied for a grant through Mass Preservation Project Fund through Mass Historical, and between Massachusetts Historical Commission and the kindness and generosity of the people of Pembroke via Pembroke Town Meeting in 1987, we got $77,000 to do stabilization work, repair, restoration work, and so forth. And when the project was done, it went beyond our wildest expectations. We were really happy. Now, like any old building, particularly one this old, repairs continue to need to be done. We just put another new roof on it. We've done more restoration on the windows to bring them up into very, very good condition. There's always little things, and as years go by, those things will continue to need to be addressed. The building will continue to need to be maintained and so forth. And we hope there are people who have an interest in this type of work. This is a first period building. They are very rare in Massachusetts. First period means buildings built in the first 100 years from the time of the Pilgrims. This building is a classic first period building. It is the oldest Quaker Meeting House in Massachusetts, and it is the third oldest Quaker Meeting House in the United States. So that in and of itself makes it a significant building. But it's a great building. I've had a love affair with it for almost 30 years, and it's worth preserving, it's worth protecting. As these things are lost to us, there's a building down the street that has enormous historic significance to the town on the corner of Route 53 and 139 that is literally being destroyed. And it breaks my heart to see these types of things happen, because these are our legacy to our children and grandchildren and the next generation, because someone thought enough to take care of it so that we could have this building here and enjoy a little bit of real American history. Well, I hope you enjoyed the tour of the Pembroke Friends Meeting House, often referred to as Quaker Meeting House. Either is appropriate. It's a wonderful old building, and we hope it continues to thrive for another 300 years. This building, as a closing note, was put on the National Register of Historic Landmarks in the year of its 300th anniversary. So that was kind of cool. It is not only a state historic landmark, it is now a national historic landmark. Thank you. Have a nice day.